comrades. If capitalism's legitimacy is today being questioned by millions of workers on a global scale, then it is being smashed for students and young workers in Britain. It was the arch defenders of capitalism, the Tories, who arrogantly entered the general election believing that young people on the day would stay at home, returning them to Parliament strengthened. But reality has jolted them, sending them into a spiral of decline and crisis. And when the Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, announces his annual budget on the 22nd of November, they will prove once again that they offer no future whatsoever for young people. And that is why on Budget Day, Socialist Students is sounding the call to escalate our resistance against the Tories at our colleges and on our campuses, not only in demand of free education, but to finish the job that we started on June the 8th by getting rid of them altogether. Because for 7 years they have been doing their very level best to force us to pay for the economic crisis of their system. And in every sphere of our lives, we can feel the weight of that crisis on our shoulders. In the world of work, the bosses for years on end have offered us nothing but precarious work and constant wage cuts, while the toxic combination of a lack of affordable housing and zero-hours contracts is beginning to drive young people out of their homes and into a life of homelessness. Politicians and the media, they collude. They tell us that if we work hard and we get into university, we have a chance of escaping this fate. Yet when we leave university, often with an average of over £50,000 of student debt, we quickly discover that we were lied to. Because the reality of the situation is, for the vast majority of us, on the basis of capitalism, there is no escaping this fate. And that is what drove the vast mobilisation of students and young workers on June the 8th in support of Corbyn's election manifesto, and was not only a reflection of our desperation and anger in the face of the current situation, but above all else our dwindling faith in the ability of the capitalist system to deliver on its own promises. For the first time, our generation were offered an alternative to the unending chaos brought upon our lives by capitalism, and we leapt at the opportunity to vote for it. But our revolt at the ballot box is only the prelude of what is to come. Running alongside the youth surge at this election, wider developments which have been preparing themselves ever since the crash, the economic crash of 2007, 2008, have started to come to the fore in 2017. And whilst in the throes of another damning scandal, as the Tories continue to sleepwalk from one crisis to the next, working people have moved quickly and decisively to strike back against the scourge of low pay, job cuts and austerity. One example being the magnificent struggle of the Birmingham bin workers against the Labour Council. Led by Howard Beckett and others, and I just want to take this opportunity to say, as someone from Birmingham and as someone who was down at the Lifford Lane picket lines, it's a privilege to share the platform with Howard today, and I just want to thank him for addressing the rally this afternoon. And all of this is the reason why students and young workers so far have only glimpsed the potential of what we can achieve. A bold student movement which demonstrates its willingness to mobilise using the most militant methods of struggle could temporarily fill the void left by the cowardly and spineless right-wing trade union leaderships and reach out to the colossal forces of the working class to decisively collapse the Tory government altogether. And it is within the growing mood of revolt which exists in our schools, our colleges and our universities that Socialist Students itself is a force whose influence amongst students has undeniably grown since the general election. Nationally, hundreds of students are attending our meetings to listen to our ideas and are looking towards our organisation as the only serious fighting force which is up to the task of offering a way forward in the current period. And that's why up and down the country, following the free education demonstration on November 15th, Socialist Students is preparing to take the lead by organising local demonstrations, walkouts and occupations of our places of education on Budget Day to escalate the struggle against tuition fees and get rid of the Tories once and for all. Because as Leon Trotsky once said, the crisis facing any movement can be reduced to the crisis facing the leadership of that movement. And while it may be the case that the leadership of the NUS and the right-wing trade unions stubbornly remain blind to the wealth of opportunities for struggle which exist right in front of them, our organisation has the utmost faith in students and the working class to fight and win. It was what our party believed when we defeated the poll tax, and it was what our party believed when we defeated Margaret Thatcher in Liverpool. But Theresa May is not the figure that Margaret Thatcher was. And we know from all of these experiences that students today do not have to wait another 5 years before we have the chance of seeing the back of May's government and winning free education. And positioned at the heart of the groups of most serious student activists, by taking action on Budget Day, we can act as the crucial lever on wider forces and events which lead to an end of an already crumbling government. And in doing so, the honour of igniting a mass working class movement which ends 7 years of Tory rule could fall to the very students and young workers in this room today. The inspiring work that our comrades have been conducting recently across the Spanish state and in Catalonia should be a stark message to the leadership of our movement here in Britain. Young people cannot be convinced to wait on you any longer. Either get brave to lead the battles which are ahead, or we will build for ourselves a new leadership worthy of the struggles necessary to fight for our futures. And to everyone today, let's not allow ourselves to miss this historic opportunity. Please, join Socialist students on November 22nd, and let's build a revolutionary force of students and workers united who will defeat the Tories and consign capitalism to history in Britain and across the globe forever.
Just taking my best line. Colleagues, comrades, first of all, it is a great privilege to be here with an event organised by the Socialist Party. I can't believe the vibrancy that is out there and in this room. The Socialist Party is a party that has always stood for one of the best principles of socialism and always crucially stood on the side of workers. My good friend Robbie Williams, who's here, there's not a picket line in this country that you can see Robbie on, and it is tremendous. I can also say to the colleagues on the platform, because it's a great privilege to share the platform with such colleagues, the fight that went on in the south of Ireland for the right to protest, extraordinary. I will be there with you in respect of November the 22nd. The idea that students leave education with £50,000 worth of debt is just extraordinary in the 5th wealthiest country in the world. So we'll be with you, Theo, standing shoulder to shoulder. Colleagues, it is very true that we do at this moment in time stand right on the cusp of a genuine socialist Labour government. But we also recognise the great injustices that exist in our society today. Extraordinary times, the 5th wealthiest country, but we have a situation where the wealthiest bosses make in 2.5 hours what most make in a year. We have a situation where the FTSE 100 bosses, the top 100 bosses, make £1,000 an hour. They make 500 times that of those in the minimum wage. They make almost 200 times that of nurses, and 150 times that of teachers. Just extraordinary. And we, colleagues, have to recognise that this is a fight for our very class. Oligarch Britain has been created and it stands in front of us, where our natural resources are in the hands of individuals, where banks operate to increase the wealth of the various few, where our natural resources are privatised and where nationalisation has just become a thing of the past. And colleagues, all of us should recognise that debt now is the modern day chains of slavery. Our students leave university with debt, saddled with debt. Our workers are saddled with debt. And the consequence of that is that the wealthiest few are not held to account. The consequence of that is that our members are starved back into work and they have to accept poverty pay. This society, the right wing of this society, has understood from the very start what debt can do. That has been the skill since Thatcherism, to saddle us with debt, our class with debt. The sale of council houses was never about giving people the option to own properties. It was always about saddling us with debt. And education is the key for our class. We must never veil from the fact that our class must be educated in order to know how modern day capitalism works. They must understand that natural resources should never be in the hands of one single person. And colleagues, I do like to say whenever I attend trade union functions, one week that I had, where on the Wednesday of that week I was addressing a conference in Liverpool. On the Monday of that week, I'd addressed a conference in Belfast where I'd heard from shop stewards of Michelin, where the site had closed because Michelin faced energy costs that were simply unaffordable. Northern Ireland, the second highest energy costs in the whole of Europe. On Tuesday, I was in a wage negotiation with INEOS, a company that was saved by the Scottish Government with millions of pounds worth of grants. Millions of pounds, making £600 million this year, arguing with us about 2.6% pay rise for our members. A country that did a presentation to me to show that Northern Ireland was one of its key customer bases, because Northern Ireland could be starved and held to ransom over energy costs. The madness of a society without an industrial policy. And colleagues, let us always remember that the disgraceful attacks on migrants, the right wing constantly attempting to demonise those who are in receipt of benefits, the constant efforts to cause division culturally and ethnically, all an attempt to prevent our class from unifying, all to stop the education of our class. Colleagues, at the centre of everything that is good in society is the trade union movement. The welfare state, equal pay, safety at work, holidays, holiday pay. The creation of a party that wanted to fight for the vote for working people. It is why trade unions have been under such constant attack. It is why the Thatcher laws were created, why the miners were disgracefully described as the enemy within, why we have the Trade Union Act today. It's because the force of trade unions without legal shackles will ultimately bring in true democracy, and true democracy will bring in true socialism. So our responsibility as leaders of the trade union movement is to now organise like we have never done before. Organise and educate. We must make the case for nationalisation of those companies that have natural resources, of transport, of the banks, the end of the disgusting bonus culture, and we must call on Labour councils to act as socialists. Yeah. It is no good for Labour councils to be compliant agents of the Treasury. It is no good for them to hide behind budgets. We want councils who will fight for services. We want councils who will fight to protect the wages of workers. We want councillors who want to stand on the side of workers, and we want councils who will feel physically sick at seeing the inequality that sees homelessness on the streets of every corner of every major city in our society. So I will say again to those councillors in Birmingham who seek to impose pay cuts on the lowest paid, who seek to take £5,000 from my bid men, I will say to them very clearly, you must uphold the ACAS deal. Labour is not a brand, and socialism is a way of life. They must now show that they are proud to stand on
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, comrades. Comrades will know that John Reid's compelling account of the October Revolution isn't called 10 Days That Shook Russia. It's called 10 Days That Shook the World. Because workers taking power in Russia, and in the unforgettable words of Lenin opening his speech to the Second Congress of Soviets, proceeding to construct the socialist order, reverberated right around the world. It inspired workers, oppressed people across the globe with the hope that they too could take power. It opened in Europe a revolutionary wave. In Ireland, that wave started with a rally of 10,000 workers in Dublin shortly after the October Revolution to celebrate that revolution. And in the period between 1917 and 1922-23, you saw a general strike in 1918, preventing successfully the imposition of conscription by British imperialism. It saw a two-day general strike in 1920, forcing the release of political prisoners, demonstrating the power of the working class. And between 1917 and 1922, it saw over 100 different groups of workers, from factories to villages to the fourth biggest city in Ireland, Limerick, taking over those places, running them themselves, and using the word Soviet to describe what they had achieved. Like in Germany, like in Italy, like in Hungary, like elsewhere in Europe, socialist revolution was possible. But without a Bolshevik party, that possibility was brutally shut down. Instead, the so-called Irish Free State was born, a few years after the Russian Revolution. It was born in a bloody counter-revolution. And the contrast between the state born in 1917 and the state born in 1922 couldn't be greater. The Soviet state was founded, and in the 1918 Constitution, with the proclamation of striving for, quote, the abolition of exploitation, the entire abolition of the division of people into classes, and the establishment of a socialist system. The Constitution separated church and state. It laid the basis for an 8-hour day, for housing, for jobs for all. It legalized divorce. It legalized LGBT rights, including same-sex marriage. Whereas the Irish state, born 5 years later, saw a weak capitalist class seeking only to play the role of middleman, facilitating the exploitation of workers and resources by British capitalism, relying on a centralized repressive apparatus to put down the revolutionary movements which preceded it, which saw the execution of anti-treaty forces without trial, which saw armed soldiers breaking up strikes, the arrests and holding of trade unionists without trial for extended periods of time. It saw massacres of those opposed to the government, again with no trial. And it saw the first commander of the police, Owen O'Duffy, who later went on to lead the fascistic blue shirts and went over to fight for Franco in Spain. And it rested on the church as a means of social control, the tying of the state and the Catholic Church together, and it unleashed a war on women. It banned contraception. There was widespread censorship of books, of films, board after board set up to censor. And it confined tens of thousands of women, incarcerated tens of thousands of women who became pregnant outside of marriage in so-called Magdalene laundries or mother and baby homes, where those women were forced to work for the church for their profit and had their babies taken from them. And 100 years on, the same essential features remain. British capitalism has been largely replaced by US and other international capital, but the same craven relationship between the Irish establishment and international capital remains. It is epitomised today so graphically. I'm sure the comrades know about the Irish state using public funds to fight a case in the European Court of Justice in order for Apple to hold on to the 13 billion euros plus interest owed to the Irish state. And the state wages a fight to say, we don't want this money, which could be used for housing, for health, for education. We want Apple to keep it and to add to their 200 billion euro cash pile that they currently have. The church retains control of 95% of primary schools. The last Magdalene laundry was shut down in 1996, but the church and the state continue to exercise control over women's bodies, denying access to abortion with tragic consequences, like the death of Savita Halappanavar 5 years ago, who on her hospital bed was told, this is a Catholic country, and that's why she couldn't access an abortion. Or of Miss Y, 3 years ago, a raped, suicidal asylum seeker who was forced to give birth against her wishes. And the repressive state remains, and it's been turned in recent years increasingly against the left and against the Socialist Party as we led a successful mass movement of protest and of non-payment to defeat the water charges. Over 200 anti-water charges protesters were arrested. We were spied on by Crime and Security, the division that's equivalent to the MI5 in Britain. And most dramatically, as Paul mentioned, they tried to jail me and 19 others for falsely imprisoning the Deputy Prime Minister and then the leader of the so-called Labour Party because our protest delayed her for 2.5 hours. But their failure to achieve that, their humiliating defeat at the hands of our campaign, is an indication of the crisis of their regime, of their inability to rule in the old way. Because we weren't just found not guilty. The jury deliberated on a 10-week trial and found us unanimously not guilty in about an hour. And the scale of the defeat
Paul, this has been a fantastic weekend, as is shown by the collection that Paul has just announced. We don't have all the figures yet, but we're pretty certain that this is the biggest socialism event that we've organised so far. Given that we have been discussing, celebrating this weekend, the centenary of the Russian Revolution, the first time that working class people took power into their own hands and began to build a society based not on private ownership and profit, but based on public ownership and democratic planning to build a society to meet the needs of all. Since then, of course, the real history of the Russian Revolution has been buried under the lies and slanders of the world's capitalist elites. And particularly in the last quarter of a century or so, since the collapse of the Stalinist regimes, they've been able to use their collapse, but also the brutal dictatorships that they became, to step up the wave of propaganda that there is no alternative to capitalism, that socialism cannot work. And for a while, superficially, you might have thought they'd succeeded. If you looked at Parliament in Britain and parliaments in country after country around the world, every party that was there sitting in the seats were in favour of capitalism, neoliberalism, privatisation, cutting the taxes of the rich, and socialism has become a dirty word. But that era is over. Look at Britain. Look at the party conference season that we've just had. One of the many good points that Jeremy Corbyn made in his speech to Labour Party conference was a point that we've made, that 2017 could become the year when politics begins to catch up with 2008 and the economic crisis that took place. It is only beginning to catch up. When it completely catches up, then we will see mass uprisings of working class people overthrowing the old capitalist order and building a new democratic socialist society. But there's no doubt in that direction. On the one side, you had Jeremy Corbyn talking about how he stood for socialism in the 21st century. And then you had the response of the Conservative Party, the Tories. No one will remember Theresa May's speech amidst the falling scenery and all the other things that happened at the Tory party conference. But let's remember, her argument, the Tories' argument, was that free market capitalism is unquestionably the best means of increasing the living standards of everyone in a country. Tell that To the 41% of young women in Britain whose wages don't last to the end of the month and have to rely on debt to get by. To the 200,000 people in Britain in 2016 who were hospitalised with malnutrition on supposedly the 6th richest country on the planet. Tell that to the working class families who have suffered the horror of Grenfell, only 2 of whom who have so far had permanent rehousing. And by the way, tell that to the residents of Tower Blocks in Wandsworth, another Tory council, where it's reported in the Observer today that they've agreed they better have fit sprinklers so there can't be another Grenfell, and they're going to charge the residents £4,000 each. They've got to pay to have the sprinklers introduced. There is growing anger at the capitalist system. Even one Tory MP summed it up when he says, why would you support capitalism if you have no prospect of owning any capital? He didn't mean being the CEO of a company or a major, big business person. What he meant is no prospect of owning your own home, or according to that, or come to that, having anywhere secure to live at all. It says everything about the crisis of capitalism, that the party going to war in its defence is this Tory party, clinging to power by its fingertips, could possibly be collapsed at any point, maybe even because of the sexual harassment scandals, or because of any of the myriad of crises that they face over the question of Brexit. A party now of less than 100,000 members, whose average age is 71. They are the past. And on the other side, we saw the electoral uprising in the election that took place in support of Jeremy Corbyn's anti-austerity stance. The biggest increase in the vote for any party in any general election since 1945. And no surprise that that was a Labour Party standing also on a radical programme. This is not just a British phenomenon. You've heard about it all weekend. Globally, the forces that defend capitalism are in disarray. And people are looking, wherever they're given the opportunity, in a left, a radical, a socialist direction. Look at the US. You heard about it last night in the fantastic speech from Sharma. The Republicans and the Democrats are both split down the middle, and they all want rid of Trump. He's a liability for them. He's a liability worldwide in that he's not under their control and he might say or do anything. But above all, he's a liability for them because of the millions of people in the US and around the world who look at him as president of the most powerful capitalist country on the planet. And they don't just draw conclusions about Trump. They say, if this is what capitalism can put in as president of the US, then there is something wrong with this system as a whole. And therefore, really, they're desperate to get rid of him. I would just say, just because the US capitalist class, the capitalist elites globally, would rather Trump was not around, it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy for them to get rid of him, to remove him, to impeach him, for example. There is an element here, and Sharma described it very vividly, of their own bankruptcy. All of you are reading about the Russian Revolution. For us today, without